It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The flowers were perfect. The music was soft and swelling. The dress clung to her like a second skin, every stitch, every lace detail chosen with care. Friends and family filled the pews. Phones in hand, hearts warmed. And yet, as Amelia stood at the altar with trembling fingers wrapped around her bouquet, there was only silence. Her groom, Daniel, was missing. At first, the whispers were light. A delay, a wardrobe issue, nerves. But then 15 minutes passed, then 20. When the priest cleared his throat and stepped away, her stomach sank. That was when someone passed her a phone, screen glowing with a text he'd sent to her maid of honor. "Tell her I can't. Do this. I'm sorry. Nothing more. No call. No explanation. Just a message." And just like that, the room collapsed into a storm of gasps, murmurs, and sideways glances. Amelia didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there in front of everyone, a bride without a groom, trying to hold on to something, her dignity, her breath, her sanity. But what broke her wasn't the abandonment. It was the silence that followed. Nobody came forward. Nobody stepped in. Except one man, a guest no one recognized, sitting alone in the back. He walked forward not with pity, but with calm. Took off his jacket and gently placed it over her shaking shoulders as the world watched. Stunned, Amelia didn't recognize him. Not in that moment, not even after he helped her off the altar with quiet dignity. The cameras kept rolling, guests frozen between discomfort and curiosity. He never introduced himself, never tried to make a scene. He simply whispered, "You don't have to stand here for them. Let's get you out of here." And somehow, his voice anchored her more than the room ever did. They exited through a side door, past floral arches and broken dreams, into the cool shade behind the church. Amelia's breath came in short bursts now, her mascara bleeding into the corners of her mouth. She didn't say a word, just stood there, gripping the bouquet like it was the only real thing left in her hands. The man didn't touch her. He simply took a clean white handkerchief from his inner pocket and offered it. When their eyes met for the first time, she noticed the calm in his gaze. Not pity, something gentler, more human. "You don't know me," he added, "but no one deserves to be left that way." She nodded, finally letting out a broken breath that felt like it had been stuck in her chest for years. They stood like that for a moment longer, a bride and a stranger, connected by nothing but the fracture of a moment. And still, in the back of her mind, something told her, this man didn't just show up today. He was already watching before. The story began. They sat together on the back steps of the chapel while the chaos buzzed on the other side of the building. Amelia finally spoke, her voice hoarse and trembling. "I must look ridiculous." He didn't smile, didn't deny it. Instead, he said softly, "You look like someone who gave everything and deserved it back." The words didn't fix anything, but they landed gently, like a bandage on a wound too fresh to close. Amelia asked his name. "Elias," he said. "No last name, no business card." Just that. She wanted to ask more, but the exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. Adrenaline was gone, and with it, the strength she had been faking. He offered her a ride, not insistently, but with the kind of tone that made it easy to say yes. The car that waited wasn't flashy, just sleek, silent, expensive in the kind of way that didn't need to announce itself. She didn't notice the driver in uniform or the way people on the street turned slightly as it passed. All she noticed was that Elias didn't fill the silence with empty words. He let her cry, not in dramatic sobs, but in quiet, private drops that trailed down her chin as the veil in her lap lay folded and forgotten. By the time they reached her apartment, he handed her a card, not for business, but a handwritten note. "If you need to talk to someone who doesn't need anything from you, You can call. Days passed in a blur of silence, voicemail condolences, and unopened flower deliveries. Amelia stayed indoors, wearing oversized sweaters and tying her hair in messy knots she never used to let anyone see. The media caught wind of the altar incident, not because of her, but because Daniel's family was well connected and gossip was inevitable. Everyone wanted a statement. She gave none. But one name echoed in her mind more than Daniel's: Elias. She hadn't called him. She didn't know if she wanted to. Part of her feared it would make the humiliation real, as if reaching out would confirm she was the abandoned girl who needed saving. But late one night, when the silence of her apartment became louder than the memories, she found the card, tucked in her drawer, and dialed. No voicemail, no assistant, he answered. Amelia? He said, like he'd been expecting her voice. They talked for almost an hour, about nothing. About music, weather, art, even terrible takeout food. He never brought up the wedding, never asked about Daniel. And that's what kept her talking. She hung up without promises, but 2 nights later, she called again, then again. What started as fragments slowly became routine. Elias never pushed. He was just ... present, steady, and for a woman who had built her life around someone who disappeared without warning, steady was an intoxicating kind of miracle. What she didn't know, what he never said, was that he'd been watching her long before the wedding fell apart. Their conversations moved from phone calls to quiet dinners, always in hidden restaurants, always away from curious eyes. Amelia never questioned the ease with which Elias got reservations or how the staff seemed to know him without asking. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did talk, his words were deliberate, thoughtful, like every sentence had passed through a filter of empathy and intelligence. She found herself laughing again, cautiously at first, then fully. Not because she was healed, but because being around him reminded her she still had pieces worth protecting. One evening, she finally asked him what he did. He looked at her for a long moment before replying, "I invest in things that matter to me." It was vague, purposefully so. She didn't push. He wasn't hiding. He was simply selective with what he gave, and strangely, she respected that. After so much of her life had been displayed like a stage play, curated engagement photos, rehearsed love stories, public affection for the sake of performance, Elias's privacy felt like peace. What Amelia didn't realize was that this man, the one who caught her when her world collapsed, wasn't just an investor. He was one of the most powerful men in the city. He had watched Daniel's company rise and saw its flaws long before. The wedding, he didn't plan to interfere. Until Daniel broke her, and that, Elias couldn't ignore. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he recognized something rare the moment she fell. Amelia's strength didn't return all at once. It crept back in quiet defiance. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. Not for galleries or approval, just for herself. Her apartment transformed from a place of mourning into a sanctuary of rebirth. And Elias kept showing up, never uninvited, always exactly when she needed silence to be shared instead of avoided. One night, while they walked along a riverside path, the air cold but not biting, she asked him something that had lingered since the day they met. "Why were you at my wedding?" He didn't pause. "I was a guest of the venue owner. I knew Daniel from a deal that almost happened years ago, but didn't." She sensed the weight in that omission. "Did you know what he'd do?" she asked. He shook his head. "I knew he wasn't the kind of man who sees what he has, only what he might gain next." It wasn't judgmental, just ... observant. And suddenly, it made sense why Elias never rushed her, never tried to impress her. He wasn't chasing anything. He had learned the value of stillness. That night, when he dropped her off, she placed her hand gently over his. Not romantic, not yet. Just gratitude, real and quiet. She didn't know if love was growing between them, but she knew one thing for sure. For the first time since the altar, she felt like she wasn't standing alone. Weeks passed, and the headlines shifted. Amelia was no longer the jilted bride in public memory. The story faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresh gossip. But her world was still changing, quietly and deeply. Elias invited her to a private art show one evening, hosted in a renovated warehouse transformed into a minimalist gallery. Her name was listed on the feature wall, not as a guest, but as one of the artists. She turned to him in disbelief. "You submitted my work?" He nodded. "With your permission, after you left your sketchbook open on the counter that night." She hadn't even realized he'd noticed. That gesture wasn't grand, but to her, it meant everything. It meant he believed she had something to offer beyond what she lost. As people wandered through the gallery, pausing before her, pieces, raw, emotional portraits of grief and quiet power, Amelia felt a version of herself return. Not the one who lived for someone else's approval, the one who created because it gave her peace. After the event, Elias didn't linger for praise. He stood beside her like always, steady, calm, unshaken. They walked outside to a courtyard, lit with soft string lights. She looked at him, not as a stranger, not even as a savior, but as someone who had seen her unravel and didn't flinch. "You never tried to fix me," she whispered. "Because you were never broken," he replied. And in that moment, something shifted, not loud, but undeniable. That same night, Amelia's phone lit up with an unexpected message. It was from Daniel. Just 3 words. "Can we talk?" Her breath caught in her chest. Not because she wanted him back, but because the past had a way of knocking just when the future started to open. She didn't respond, not immediately. Instead, she told Elias, not for permission, but because she believed he deserved the truth. His response was as calm as ever. "Closure matters," he said. "Just don't mistake it for permission to bleed again." So the next morning, Amelia met Daniel at a coffee shop downtown. He was thinner, distracted, less golden than she remembered. The conversation wasn't dramatic. He apologized, not with flowers or guilt, but with a tired voice that finally admitted his fear. "I couldn't go through with it. Not because of you, because I didn't know who I was without the image we built." Amelia listened, but didn't save him. She simply nodded, her silence more powerful than any argument she could offer. When he asked if there was someone else, she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way you think." Daniel looked confused. She didn't explain. She didn't owe him that. Because Elias wasn't just a man she was seeing. He was a mirror that never distorted her. And that kind of presence wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about being seen by someone who never asked her to shrink. After Daniel left, Amelia walked without direction, letting the city move around her like background noise. She didn't feel victorious, just clean. Like someone who had finally set down a weight she forgot she'd been carrying. That evening, she didn't tell Elias what Daniel had said. She simply showed up at his apartment, a place she had never entered before. It wasn't what she expected. No marble, no crystal chandeliers, just books, plants, and quiet jazz playing in the background. He was barefoot, reading, and when he saw her at the door, he didn't smile wide or say anything poetic. He just opened the door and stepped aside. That night, they talked for hours. About nothing. About everything. She asked him finally what he really did, no more vague answers. And this time, Elias didn't deflect. He told her the truth, the companies, the shares, the power, and most of all, the loneliness that came with it. "I've spent most of my life being the one who watches," he admitted. "And for once, I wanted to step in." She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She sat beside him, curled her feet under her, and said, "Okay." Because at the end of everything, the most surprising part wasn't that he was a billionaire. It was that he never used it. He had caught her tears, yes. But what mattered more was what he never tried to catch: her independence, her silence, her choices. And that's how she knew it was real. 1 year later, the church where it all fell apart hosted a different kind of event, an art charity fundraiser. Amelia's name was printed in gold across the program cover, now a featured artist and guest speaker. She hadn't returned to this place since the wedding. But tonight, she walked in not with hesitation, but with grace. Her hand was wrapped gently in Elias's, not held tightly, not claimed, just shared. People stared. Whispers rippled. Some recognized her. Fewer recognized him. And even fewer understood the quiet reversal that had taken place. The girl who was once left at the altar now arrived beside a man who could have owned any room, but chose to stand silently behind her. Instead, as she stood near the front entrance, Daniel passed by with someone new. Their eyes met. It was brief and empty of bitterness. He offered a small nod, and she returned it. No smile, no smirk, just peace. Elias leaned slightly toward her, speaking low. "Still want to be here?" She turned to him, eyes calm. "Yes, I think this place needed to see me again, standing. That was the difference." She hadn't come to haunt the past or parade the present. She came because she had nothing to hide anymore. That church had seen her broken. Now it would see her whole. And standing beside her wasn't a man who saved her, but one who believed she never needed saving in the first place. After the speeches, after the polite handshakes and flashes of cameras, Amelia stepped outside for air. The same stone steps. Where she had once sat trembling in her wedding gown now felt different beneath her heels. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the night breeze touch her skin, not to relive the past, but to reclaim it. Elias joined her, hands in his pockets, his presence quiet as ever. "You've changed," he said, not as a compliment, but as a simple truth. She nodded. "No, I just finally stopped apologizing for who I was before I was abandoned." He smiled at that, the small, warm kind of smile that felt like a sunrise behind calm eyes. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. Love wasn't declared between them in grand gestures. It lived in the spaces they shared, in the patience between moments, in the steadiness of two people who understood the cost of being misunderstood. Amelia knew what people would say, that she had won, that she'd traded up, but it was never about that. She hadn't chased a man with money. She hadn't waited to be chosen again. She had chosen herself first, and only after that did someone worthy arrive, not to fix her, but to walk beside her. There, beneath the stars and stone, she reached for Elias's hand, not out of need, but out of want. And that difference made all the difference in the world. The following morning, the tabloids tried to spin the moment. Billionaire caught holding hands with former runaway bride. Headlines built for clicks. Not truth, but Amelia didn't care. She'd stopped living for their version of her a long time ago. She returned to her studio, tied her hair up, and painted until the sun began to fade. Not out of sadness, not even out of triumph, but because creation had always been her way of breathing. Elias dropped by later with coffee and said nothing about the press. He simply placed the cup beside her canvas and kissed the top of her head like it was the most normal thing in the world. That's what love had become, not fireworks, but foundation. Not loud declarations, but quiet constancy. And as she looked around at the life she had built, one that had begun in ashes and humiliation, she realized something she hadn't before. Sometimes, The greatest story isn't about who hurt you. It's about who stayed when everything else fell apart, including yourself. She didn't need to prove anything to Daniel, to the world, or even to Elias. She had proven it to the one person who mattered most, the woman in the mirror who once stood at the altar alone and now stood unshaken. That woman now knew her worth. And that kind of knowing couldn't be taken, only shared. With someone who never tried to rewrite her story, but chose to honor the pages as they were.